Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Reflections on Asian American and Pacific Islander History in the U.S. I'm Raj Benot, HBS Project Manager at National Center here in Dallas and President of the H3 Club, HA's employee resource group supporting Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and South Asian communities. A few housekeeping items for today. Today's panel discussion is being recorded and will be made available to attendees within 24 to 48 hours. And you will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing them into your Q&A chat tool. You may send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Before we get started with today's program, I would like to remind everyone that while we celebrate AAPI month, last Thursday, President Biden also signed in the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. We must be mindful of how members of our communities that we work with, our volunteers, and our staff members have been impacted over the past year. It is unfortunate that the situation has come to this. I am hopeful and thankful for the allies that we have gathered along the way. So with that, I would now like to hand it over to our moderator for today's event, Senior Vice President of Human Resources for the AHA's Western States Regions, Sherry Chang. Sherry, over to you.
Thank you so much, Raj, and thank you to our H3 Employee Resource Group. I do want to offer a special shout out to those who planned today's program, along with you, of course. That's Donna Liu, Sandeep Gill, Ray New, Jackie Mariano, Celine Chardin, Elaine Kitamura, and Lonnie Gokiala, as well as our Hawaii Division team members, Don Weissman and Jacob Pennington, and from Business Technology, Chris Kwan. And many thanks to each of you for taking time out of your day to join this conversation as we commemorate Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. In the month of May, we recognize the contributions that generations of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders have made to the history, society, and culture of the United States. It's a rather broad term. The AANHPI encompasses all of the Asian continent and the Pacific Islands of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. I've been asked to offer a little background into the AAPI Heritage Month itself. In 1977, Representatives Frank Horton and Norman Mineta introduced a U.S. House of Representatives resolution to proclaim the first 10 days of May as Asian Pacific Heritage Week. The proposed resolution sought that May be designated for two reasons. One being on May 7th, 1843, the first Japanese immigrant arrived in the United States. The second being on May 10th, 1869, when the Golden Spike was driven into the first transcontinental railroad, which was completed using primarily Chinese labor. President Jimmy Carter signed a joint resolution for the celebration on October 5th, 1978. And in 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed a bill that passed by Congress to extend Asian American Heritage Week to a month. May was officially designated as Asian Pacific American Heritage Month 2 years later. Of course, we come together at a very fraught time with today marking 1 year since the death of George Floyd, and next week marking 100 years since the Tulsa Race Massacre. Opportunities like this to come together, to learn, and to take action are so valuable. And I want to thank our incredible employee resource groups and our Office of Health Equity for making programs like this possible. In today's webinar event, our goals are to reflect and share about AA and HPI history within the United States and explore how the past has contributed to health disparities within AA and HPI communities that exist today. We'll also take time to identify actions to address the rising racism and intolerance faced not only by our communities, but other groups as well. I am absolutely honored to be joined today by our expert panelists who will speak on these topics and answer questions that you may have. Now, here are the introductions. Our first panelist is Dr. Joseph Keawe Keholekule, who is Professor and Chair of Native Hawaiian Health in the John A. Burns School of Medicine at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and a licensed clinical psychologist. His research involves developing community-based and culturally relevant health promotion programs to address diabetes and cardiovascular disease inequities in Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders using community-based participatory research practices. As a Native Hawaiian, he is passionate about improving the health of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and has made a lifelong commitment to improving their social and cultural determinants of health. Our second panelist is Keith Osajimina, who is Professor and Director in the Race and Ethnic Studies program at the University of Redlands in Redlands, California. He is in his 15th year at the University of Redlands, having taught previously at the University of California, Davis and Colgate University. Professor Osajimina, as I'm told by his students, Professor Keith teaches core major courses in the program such as Introduction to Race and Ethnic Studies and Race Theory. He also teaches courses on whiteness and anti-racism, environmental justice, race in higher education, and Asians in the United States. Professor Osajimina has written numerous articles on Asian Americans in higher education, covering issues related to the politics of race in education, internalized racism, and the model minority stereotype. And our third panelist is Dr. May Wong, who is Professor at Community Health Sciences at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Wong received an undergraduate degree from the National University of Singapore, a master's degree in nutritional science from the University of Texas at Austin, and master's and doctorate degrees in public health from the University of California at Berkeley. After obtaining her doctorate degree, she completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University School of Medicine, where she was trained in the emerging field of pediatric bone health research. Since then, she has conducted research related to child obesity and bone health. Dr. Wong has a special interest in the social and physical environmental determinants of diet-related conditions with a focus on childhood obesity, immigrant food-related behaviors, and evaluations of nutrition programs for children. And May did share that her first grant was from the American Heart Association. So many thanks to each of you for being with us. Why don't we dive into our discussion? Now, our first question, I'll ask each of you to share your thoughts. Can you share what does AA and HPI Heritage Month mean to you? And perhaps a piece of history in the US that applies personally to you and your community, and how the historical moments are still relevant in their impact today. So may we start with you?
Sure. I think this is this whole month, I think what it symbolized to me, I think in this group of panelists too, I'm probably the one person who was born in another country, and I haven't been here, I guess, over a generation. And I've just seen my thoughts about racism evolve. I think from, just seeing my children, having conversations with them. And I arrived in the US in Iowa to study in 1981. And this was the year before the Vincent Chin incident in the Midwest in Michigan. And I vaguely remember reading it and not really understanding at that point in time. I'd been here for just one year. It's like, how can people do things like this? You know, I think that was the beginning of my consciousness about the hate that comes along with racism. And then sadly, I think a lot of that kind of came back this past year, right? When we started seeing, you know, assaults of the elderly particularly. And it's, I'm just trying to really understand, how do we, you know, I love the fact that you have harmony in this group, right? And health, because it's all kind of related. And our health, when there isn't harmony, it's not only about us, it affects everybody, our families and all of that. So I just want to thank you all so much for bringing us all together to have this discussion. And I look forward to it. So thank you.
Thank you, May. Keave, can we turn to you for your thoughts?
Sure. Well, first of all, mahalo to all of you, the American Heart Association, for doing this and for the invite. I'm honored and pleased to be here. When I think of this Heritage Month for us, I think about our celebration of our uniqueness, of our contributions to the society, of our unique histories and relationships here in the United States. It's a time for us to reflect on the future, the present, as well as the past. But for many of us, it's also time to look back at the challenges we have faced as a community. You know, for Native Hawaiians in particular, we were once a sovereign nation that was illegally occupied by the United States. In fact, the international legal community still considers Hawaii occupied territory because the United States have never acquired the US under lawful means. And therefore, you know, Native Hawaiians, we still maintain our sovereignty, although the government operating under that sovereignty is not ours. What does it have to do with health and well-being? Well, it has everything to do. You know, colonialism is a determinant of health for indigenous populations. Much like American Indians, Alaska Natives in this country, we had our own government, we had our own societies prior to the Western intrusion on our communities. And this has had a profound effect on our people. To this day, we've been put at a disadvantage because of that in economics, in education, and even in our health, as you know. And you know, we still struggle with that, and we aspire to revitalizing our culture, our language that was legislatively banned by the U.S. government for many of us, that prevent us from passing on our language. Luckily, we're able to revive it, and now we have a growing number of native speakers in our own language. But these are part of our culture and our health and well-being. So, you know, this month allows us to remember those things and look positively towards the future. And how do we address, recover, and heal from those things collectively? Mahalo.
Address, recover, and heal. That's powerful. Thank you, Keave. And Keith, your thoughts?
Yeah, this is the risk of being the last one because everybody has said such wonderful things. But I look on the screen, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's a wonderful way for us in various communities to come together from lots of different places. And so having this month, having this time set aside to think about those connections as well as the richness and the diversity within our communities is one of the things that I really appreciate about having AAPI Heritage Month happen. I think the other thing that, you know, at the same time, it reminds us that for many times out of the year, we don't think about ourselves or other people don't think about us very much. And that speaks to the ways I think AAPI experiences have been invisible and have been pushed aside or have not been gotten the kind of attention that other communities may get. And so, you know, it's always a little bittersweet. There's a moment where we could celebrate and be, you know, excited and really relish all of the richness that we bring. But it's also a time when we can note the ways that even though we have these different experiences, we are still vulnerable to being seen and mistreated, still vulnerable to being seen as a homogenous other or a foreign or a distinct group that is different and doesn't belong. And so it is a time to reflect again on that. for me, I think the chance to get together is really speaks to the ways in which we need to and benefit from building community, building connections across all of the different experiences. And so, you know, I just love seeing at least the four of us here, you know, representing very different experiences. In my case, I'm a third generation Japanese American. And so my grandparents came from Japan in the early 1900s. And my family has been very affected by the kinds of anti-Japanese sentiment and anti-Asian sentiment that has spanned the 20th century, I should say. And so, you know, I remember growing up and never having any kind of discussion or conversation about the internment experience. And it took the Asian American movement, you know, starting in the late 1960s to really kind of bring some of these to the forefront. And I think we're here today because of those efforts. So it's really wonderful to be here.
Oh, thank you, Keith. And again, thank you to each of you for joining us this afternoon or morning. Keawe, why don't we start with you with this next question? Can you describe the intersectionality between racism and public health? How has AANHPI history and structural racism led to health disparities and the marginalization of health and well-being for specific AANHPI communities? You already started sharing a little bit about the Native Hawaiian experience. Can you elaborate?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank the American Heart Association for coming out with the statement calling out structural racism and its impact on public health. You know, I think it's more than an intersectionality between racism and public health. Racism is the underlying current, unfortunately, that's really driving a lot of our health disparities, especially for communities of color right here in the United States. You know, I spoke earlier about the circumstances of Native Hawaiians. It's similar for many Pacific Islander groups as well, for which they had really no choice but to be under the flag of the United States and have had lost tremendous cultural losses, as well as loss of land and self-governance that has really impacted their health and well-being. You know, from a scientific standpoint, you know, I look at the effects of racism, the experience of racism on the health of Native Hawaiians. And when we look at its effects on risk for hypertension, for example, and cardiovascular disease in general, we find that Native Hawaiians who experience more racism over the course of the past year also have greater risk for hypertension. They have a greater risk for type 2 diabetes. We also see that they also have what we're calling, you know, kind of a dysregulated cortisol kind of response throughout the day because of that. So what I mean by that, in our studies, we're finding that they produce less cortisol over the course of a day compared to Native Hawaiians who report less discrimination. And so that we're thinking, you know, it gets really, that's how it gets under the skin, right? How racism gets under the skin. It affects as our physiological indices, such as, you know, the stress hormone of cortisol that I mentioned. We also found that it's associated with systolic blood pressure, which, as we know, higher systolic blood pressure is a risk for cardiovascular disease in the future. And we experimental studies looking at cardiovascular reactivity and recovery, how fast someone responds physiologically to a racist stimuli, as well as how long it takes them to recover, the recovery period. And studies have shown that the length of recovery after a stressful stimuli or a stressful experience is predicts future cardiac events or predicts cardiovascular disease in the future for many communities. There's studies on African Americans that show this, but we found it in Native Hawaiians as well, that there was an association between the experience of a racist interaction and how long it took them to recover. What was interesting, we're finding that, you know, blatant racism is maybe even worse subtle racism may be worse than blatant racism. You know, blatant racism, you know, you can call it for what it is, and you can somewhat make a choice, right? If I go to a restaurant I feel discriminated against, I can choose not to go there. I can put it on Yelp, I can Twitter, I can do a lot of things that somehow allows me to deal with it in that moment. But when it's subtle, well, you spend a lot of cognitive energy trying to figure it out and a lot of frustration. And that carries with you much longer because you're not able to release that. And we're finding these things have an impact, and that's how it's affecting the health of our communities. Yeah. So structural racism, colonialism for Native people are very much the underlying factors that are contributing to our disparities. And so those are things we hope that can be changed in this going forward.
Thank you, Keawe. And we'll dive into perhaps some of the response remedies that we can take for that. May I know you have thoughts on this question as well?
Sure, thank you, Sherry. Yeah, so a lot of my work is on food insecurity, and I think, and on food behaviors. And if you think about structural racism, think about, a lot of times people think about access to healthcare services, but it's also about access to information, you know, and there's just been so much misinformation that's been going around this past year and a half. Not that it's anything new, it's just kind of got magnified because of the pandemic. And I think it really made us realize how ineffective we have been in terms of reaching out to non-mainstream white groups in terms of getting, you know, health messages across in an efficient way. And part of it has to do with just institutionalized, how policies are institutionalized in such a way that it makes it difficult to get these messages out. So yes, there's a law, I think, that says, you know, you can produce a card and says, I don't speak this language, you know, find me a translator. But it's the implementation of that, you know, who's going to wait 4 days to go find that translator, right? And part of it, I think, is not recognizing that you know, these health disparities, I think sometimes people think of it as somebody else's problems. What people don't realize is that when we have this huge disparity, you know, in terms of different groups having higher rates of cardiovascular disease that Keawe's talked about, hypertension and all of that, the whole community is affected. And I think this is something that I talk a lot about in my classes. It's, you know, people think of, gosh, the US is one of the richest countries in the world. Why do we have food insecurity, right? And then of course, here in the US, we're thinking, yes, there's this racism. And then of course, everybody's thinking it's their problem, etc. What people don't realize is that all of our health indicators are affected. The entire country is actually affected. It's not only very specific groups. And when you look at the data, so other countries, you know, where that gap isn't as great, the population health for everyone is just much better. So, you know, I think when we talk about racism and all of that, I hope people realize that this is the problem in everybody's backyard. It's not in someone else's backyard either. And that if we can kind of work collectively to address this, then, you know, we can kind of move forward as a nation.
Oh, thank you, May. And I'm struck by the perspective that you bring coming from Singapore to your work here in the United States and being able to see the social determinants of health at play. I think before that became mainstream in our conversation. So thank you. Keith, your thoughts?
Yeah, I really appreciate the work that Keawe and May are doing, especially the studies to look at specifically the way those things are playing out in our blood pressure and our, you know, all of those things, because I think all of us have intuitively suspected that there is this relationship between the ways in which we have been treated as individuals and members of group in a society that has been dominated by racism and settler colonialism. And I think we all know inside that, and we have all felt the ways in which maybe we have been othered, the ways that we have felt disrespected or not seen very well. And part of what is damaging about that is not being able to put our finger on it, not being able to see what's going on. So those studies that you're doing is really kind of showing those effects and helping us to recognize that. As I think about, and I also appreciate the kind of emphasis on the subtle ways in which it works, because, you know, especially as the country has gotten a little bit more, at least nominally tolerant or intolerant of overt racism, there may be a little bit of a misleading thing to think that, wow, we've made great progress, but there are all of these other ways that we are subjected to slights and, you know, what people call microaggressions that take its toll on people. And so, you know, getting the kind of language, getting the kind of vocabulary that can help us to identify these things really is important to show how those connections are not just individual. It's not just me that's worried about this, but it's something that's happening across the board. And it's so important to make the connection, because it's as an individual, it might be easy to say, well, you know, I could deal with it, or it's just me. But when we see those patterns happening across groups, then it's a little bit more, it's a bigger thing. And I think that's what's so important about seeing these kinds of connections that we're seeing and now coming out through these scientific studies. So, you know, that kind of recognition and vocabulary and concepts is so important, so valuable.
Thank you, Keith. And we'll stay with you for this next question, if you don't mind.
Uh-oh. Which one was it?
This is a heavy one. So hate crimes against Asian Americans in major US cities has grown nearly 150% in this past year. One of the most traumatic events, of course, taking place in March, when a gunman fatally shot 8 people, including 6 Asian women. How can we as a community and as a nation heal from tragedies like this and take individual steps to prevent such an event from occurring in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was interesting to see some of the slides on the history, right? I had an opportunity to do some talking with people after the Atlanta killings, and the place my mind went, of course, is that this is something that's been happening throughout the history of Asians in this country. And even my small town of Redlands, California, drove out the small community of 200 people, Chinese people in the 1890s. And so, and May mentioned the Vincent Chin case. So we are all familiar with it. We know that this is happening. Knowing that history, recognizing that history, I think, is an important part. Again, I think that it's important to see that our destinies have been shared. We share certain commonalities. We share certain kinds of ways we've been treated and seen. And that's an important, again, an important way to see that what we're trying to deal with is larger than our individual selves. And it is part of a history of mistreatment and a history of racism that we need to remember as a way of then seeing that, and not that it's not an anomaly, but that what we're fighting against is something bigger. And I think that when we can do that as a community, as disparate communities coming together, that's what's been very heartwarming to see. So many people coming out from various different Asian American organizations, AAPI organizations, taking a stand. That's a very powerful thing that doesn't always happen. And that's why it's fitting, I mean, you know, that this is the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder, because that galvanized the entire nation. And so when this happened, this tragedy happened in Atlanta, we had this precedent of people not sitting silently, but speaking out. And that kind of power, that kind of community, sense of community, I think, is empowering. And that kind of empowering feeling is part of what we need to do to heal. It's saying, you know, we're not going to take this, right? That we're not gonna stand by and not speak out. And that is so important when many of us, I think, in long stretches of our lives have probably had to wrestle with, well, should I say something or not? should I do something or not? But there's so many groups and there's so many people doing this that it builds a momentum. And so I've been very heartened by that.
I was struck this morning. I was at a vigil, and a friend of mine took the time after to ask me how my 81-year-old mother was doing, concerned about her safety in Los Angeles. And it struck me as really how common and tragic this all is. May, thoughts that you might want to share on this?
Well, this is a very difficult question, and I think so. I agree with Keith, and he said, this everything that's happened this past year, George Floyd, and then all the incidents that happened after that. This, I think, galvanized many communities, and this whole idea of I'm seeing people speaking up a lot more. I'm seeing it on Zoom. I'm hearing about many people organizing events. Maybe it's because I'm in California. I'm not really sure. Although physically I'm in Hawaii right now, and it's I think it is really important for people to continue to realize that it is about mistreatment of a human being. And that humanness is what connects every single one of us. And so I'm hopeful. I'm on all these EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusivity committees. And sometimes we tend to focus on something that's really tangible, like changing the curriculum. And I'm not saying that's not important. I think it is very important to change curriculum to make sure that facts are known. But at the same time, it's more, I think we have to go beyond that. And as one of our staff members, this African-American pointed out, it's about changing people's hearts, and understanding that there's this connectivity between every human being, regardless of color, regardless of how you look, regardless of socioeconomic status. And I think if we can kind of try to work towards that, I'm hopeful. I have to be hopeful. Yeah, so I must thank you to everyone who's actually spent their lives like Keith working on these issues, because I'm sure it's a very difficult issue to be working on.
Absolutely. And May, along those lines, are there specific insights that you have for those of us in the AA and HPI community as to how we can, stand with others who are experiencing racism?
Is that to me?
To you, Keith, or to May? We'll start with you.
Who's going? Who's going? May, you want to go?
Oh, go ahead, Keith.
Well, I've been thinking about that. One of the things that I have thought a lot about is the way that Asian Americans, in particular in the United States on the mainland, have really been put in an awkward position vis-a-vis race relations in the United States. So starting in the 60s, well, actually earlier than that, but certainly organized in the 60s was the whole idea of the model minority, that Asian Americans are the successful group, that are and that there was a very, very distinct and very clear narrative about Asian Americans working hard, respecting authority, that there's some kinds of cultural practices that lead to the kinds of educational, occupational success. And if you look at those articles that came out in the 1960s, they were not very subtle about what the purpose was. They said very clearly, while Black and brown communities are having trouble with this and this, here's a group that is doing well. While other people are asking for money in their communities, here's a group that is making it on their own. This, I think, is something that we all are subject to, those messages. And even when we try to maybe be aware of them, I think there's ways that we may internalize those messages, and it may keep us apart from our African-American and Latino brothers and sisters, because there may be ways in which we think we're better than, or we're exempt from those kinds of mistreatments because we're in this group. So at this moment, you know, we have to, as a community, really resist that kind of temptation to think, either because we want to not experience it, we don't want to call attention to ourselves and get that kind, or we may think that, you know, we've made it and others haven't. So if we want to be in solidarity with the Black Latinx community, the Native community in Hawaii and on the mainland, you know, we have to be aware of those ways in which people may not trust us right away, and ways in which we may not reach out and see ourselves in solidarity with them. And so, you know, it continues to be a dangerous narrative that's going on there. And it comes up conveniently, right? Whenever it's happened over time, whenever there's some uprising, we are held up as a group. And that's not a productive way to build connection and solidarity with other groups.
May?
Sure, thank you, Sherry. And Keith, thank you. You said that so beautifully. And I think, you know, I don't study this academically. As you know, I study more childhood obesity. And I'm going to share actually from the experience of being a first generation mom who raised my kids here. You know, I think when I saw them growing up, going into school, I learned a lot from them about what they were learning in school. And I think this whole idea of the Asian model minority, I think years ago, when my kids were in high school, I actually started a nonprofit with a close friend of mine, Stephen Murphy Shikamatsu. I mentioned his name because he just wrote this fantastic book. It's called From Mindfulness to Heartfulness, I think. And he talks a lot about bringing people together and that connection between human beings. And I used to think, you see, I have one kid who's highly musical and he's doing really well now. But as an Asian mom, I remember people asking me questions like, oh, you're letting your son study music? And I'm like, that's his choice. And it's kind of a bit shocking. And then the next question was, so, is he not doing well in school? Then when I say no, he's actually the top student in school, people are like totally shocked. Why am I letting him study music? And a lot of it's about helping human beings be themselves. I think in this whole conversation, I think what we all want to be is to be accepted for who we are. We don't have to pretend to be somebody that we're not. And I'm, you know, I mean, in groups when we're interacting with people who come from different backgrounds, different cultures, a lot of it is about self-awareness and us realizing sometimes that we all do have biases, and how do we overcome them, and how do we accept a person without judging. And, you know, and we all, every one of us, I think, has biases. And, you know, it's about being a human being, right? You grew up and you're influenced in many ways. So, and that self-awareness, I think, is so important. I give this example to my students because sometimes they're, you know, well, so what biases do you have, given that I talk about these issues a lot? I said, I do have a bias. And I'm sorry, I hope there's no one in the audience I'm going to offend, but I'm still struggling with the fact that I sometimes have students who have ear piercings in their tongues, and I can't get over that. And I'm so conscious of it that I have to listen to the student, what the student is saying, and not be looking at this glitter that comes up. But I'm aware and I'm trying to work to overcome it, right? And so I think having that kind of self-awareness, working towards that as we kind of interact with other people, I think is so important.
Thank you for that, May. Keawe, would you want to add to that? And then I have a question coming for you.
I don't know if I can add any more than what Keith and May have so excellently said about these issues, and I couldn't agree more with them. I'll just say, when I was listening to both of them, it reminded me of Robert Sapolsky's work. He's a neuroendocrinologist researcher at Stanford. I believe he's still there. He wrote the book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, but he studies non-human primates. And what's fascinating, and the reason why I bring this up is, some of his work shows that the leaders in these non-human primate communities have a huge influence on the health and well-being, the life expectancy of the entire group. And I say this because our leadership here in the United States in most recent times, I believe, have led and created some of, obviously, the issues that we're facing today with around racism and these attacks against our Asian communities. It has emboldened a few, and for whatever reason, I think it's important for us to recognize that leadership does matter. And when we have leadership that is indifferent, racist, prejudicial, what have you, it's going to affect the whole culture of the United States and everyone. And I think for us, that's one thing. If you talk about what can we do to address some of these, well, we can look to our leadership and maybe vote in a way that ensures that all people here are safe, and feel connected and feel part of this society. And that's the only thing I could add to this. Just his work, and his work just reminded me of how important that is, because I think we underestimate. We look at individual reasons for why people are suffering or disadvantaged. We look for maybe some upstream social reasons, environmental factors and other things, but we forget how much politics, our leaders in politics and policies themselves really affect us as a people, and can really influence how people treat others. And I would encourage us to really take that seriously.
Along those lines, how would you describe being anti-racist, and in what ways can we more effectively demonstrate allyship and be proactively anti-racist?
Yeah, here in Hawaii, we've really been looking at the larger structures again and systems in place that really put us at a disadvantage or really perpetuate inequities. I'm going to say this, and I hope people don't misunderstand what I say, but I do mean what I say, is that in order for us to address inequities, we need to be inequitable in our approaches. And I say that because, right now we do these special programs to get minorities into education, into different settings, into the medical field. But they're really workarounds around a status quo system that still places people at a disadvantage. It doesn't really address the larger issues. And I think anti-racism ideas really is about changing the entire structure of things, changing how we view inequities. It's not about working within the same old system that caused the inequities. It's about really changing those systems. I say we need to be inequitable in our approaches because right now, the federal law doesn't require us to give special considerations to any racial ethnic minority, with the exception of American Indians, Alaska Natives, right? Because of their federal status as a tribal and sovereign nations. But yet, how are we going to address inequities if we don't start pushing the other way and making things a little off balance a bit in the other way? Right now, it's been favoring the dominant group. It's been favoring certain groups, but it hasn't been favoring many of our groups. And to me, the NIH and others have come out and said, if we continue with the status quo approaches that we're taking now to increase equity in education and the sciences and the medical field, it'll take us centuries to reach parity. That's unacceptable. We can't wait centuries because we only can hit a few people at a time. We need to switch the way we're doing things. We need to be inequitable in our approaches. And I don't say that in a bad way. I say that in a way that really is about getting those who are most disadvantaged, getting them to the starting line, right? Right now, they're behind because of historical events, right? You know, a lot of people, a lot of us, Asians, Pacific Islanders, African Americans, couldn't own property at one point, couldn't vote. Imagine how that affected intergenerational wealth when you don't have the equity from your property to transfer to the next generation to help them out. So here in Hawaii, where there's a high cost of living, a lot of our families, they have to spend 20, 30 years to raise that 20% to put down. And then along comes others who have this intergenerational wealth, and they're able to transfer their equity to help out the next generation and give them a start at a different baseline, if you will. And these are real issues for us that we got to address. We're starting from behind, and we need to change the starting line for us to be equitable. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Keawe. Keith, what would you add?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's exactly right in terms of, we've got to work on the policies and the structures and doing all of that stuff. So let me just, rather than go on about that, let me just say that the complementary thing that I think about is that we need to kind of figure out ways in which we as individuals and small communities can work in a consistent, sustained way, not get too burned out, take care of ourselves so that we can do this work. I struggle with, we could be doing this we could be just doing this 20, some people are doing it 24 hours, 7 days a week, but that takes a toll on us. And so, I guess I would also encourage us to do that work, be committed to it, do it and there's so many places where it can be done, where the work needs to be done. Work in a place that you have some skills and some strengths, do it in a way that you could sustain yourself and sustain that effort. Do it in a way that, I guess for me at least, it means being a little bit more forgiving of making mistakes and not being perfect, and not letting that stop me from doing it. So, on that, so that's sort of the micro level on how we work with some of the structural things, but I do think about how we need to take care of each other. And that's where this notion of community and being connected to each other can be really an important part of it, right? So that's what comes to mind.
Thank you for that. And, I will say that the American Heart Association community, has been such a source of strength, right, through, again, what we all know to be very difficult times. A question to each of you: what resources would you recommend our audience read, watch, learn, listen to, so that we can learn more about AA and NPI communities in America and the issues that we've discussed today? May, we'll start with you.
Well, I love Grace Lee Boggs' writings. I think she's been a favorite of mine. And she's been a real source of inspiration too. I actually love to learn about these things. It's interesting. All my work is on nutrition science and all of that. So I love reading these novels that kind of really play out people's lives and lived experiences. So, of course, Amy Tan is one of my favorites. And her recent memoir was actually, I was quite intrigued by it. And then, I mentioned Stephen Murphy Shigematsu's name earlier. He's, in full disclosure, he's actually a good family friend. But he's written many books, but his latest book on mindfulness to heartfulness, I thought was incredibly well written. And he's trained as a clinical psychologist, so he's kind of integrated, all what he's learned from his patients and kind of put them in a way that is, I think, easy for people to kind of identify with. So those are some suggestions I have.
Thank you, May. Kathy, how about you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question, because up until now, at least I have talked about a lot of the inequities. It's nice to talk about some of the strengths of our communities. And for me, and then the research I do, so not only do I look at the racism and its effects on health, so the basic science part of it, we also look at developing culturally responsive strategies to addressing them. And what we're finding is that our community, and we always knew this, our communities have the answer. It really is about, as May pointed out, listening to the lived stories, the lived experiences of people and what they're saying. And what people are saying, especially our Native communities, is that, we've been disconnected from our way of life, our culture, our lands, our ability to live according to our own aspirations. And when we do take that into consideration and we design an intervention approach, and we consider the strengths of our culture, of our communities, we're finding that it has a huge impact on health outcomes on a scientific level. And I share this with you. We recently conducted a randomized control trial. And I think it's the first time that we've looked at a indigenous practice scientifically through a control trial, which is, as you know, is considered the gold standard for efficacy. And we use hula, our traditional dance of Hawaii, as the means of addressing hypertension to reduce future cardiovascular disease in Native Hawaiians. And it was amazing what we found. Compared to a waitlist control, the hula intervention led to significant improvements. And these are people who had hypertension that was uncontrolled, meaning despite seeing a physician, 86% of them were on antihypertensive medication. They were still uncontrolled. Their blood pressure, systolic blood pressure was above 140. And so undergoing the cultural-based intervention at the end of the 6 months and all the way out to 12 months, they reduced their systolic and diastolic blood pressure. They actually reduced their 10-year risk for cardiovascular disease using the Framingham risk scores. But what's more interesting to me, because we knew it would work, that's why we did the study, right? But no one does a long study like that anticipating nothing, right? But what was amazing was that when we look at what really is associated with those improvements, a lot of it was social and cultural factors. For example, social engagement, as that improved, it predicted improvements in blood pressure. As I'm interested in racism, I mentioned earlier, so we actually measured that. And what we found was people who underwent our hula intervention over time reported significantly less experience of racism than the control group. Control group had no change. Now, I don't think the world has changed that rapidly for them in which there's no racism, but something about a cultural-based intervention approach empowered them. And I think gave them the ability to deal with these other stressors in a more effective way. And I think we need to do that going forward, is really listen to our communities. I think we like to take on, these evidence-based approaches and all these other things, but they're not evidence-based for everyone. The evidence is contingent upon the sample from which the evidence was derived. So it does, so we need to consider those things. I'll stop there because I'm excited about that, because I think for Native communities, Pacific Islands, and probably same for a lot of our Asian communities, is going back to some of our traditional perspectives, practices, and values can really be leveraged for health promotion. So mahalo.
Thank you. There is an endless amount to be able to learn across our AA and HPI communities and draw from those strengths. Keith, what recommendations do you have for us?
Yeah, I'd love hearing about that study. I've done a little work with this group called Suru for Solidarity, TSURU for Solidarity, and I mentioned this group because the solidarity is key, right? So we did some stuff to help write letters on behalf of HR 40, the reparations for African Americans, going through to try and do that. We've done some work there on going to the detention centers on the border. So it's really an effort to take the Asian American experience and build those connections. So there's that group. I think about one of the oldest anti-Asian violence groups, the Committee on Against Anti-Asian Violence in New York, is another. They've been around since, for quite a while. And then I want to, many of you have probably gone to this, but the hashtag Stop AAPI Hate has just played a significant role in gathering the numbers. And so again, having the information that we could use to make these cases for, paying attention to it and doing something about it, just like the studies that May and Keawe are doing, are so important. And so that's a group that has really helped bring that to attention. And then I was reading this book by Kathy Park Hong called Minor Feelings. She gives some, it's a memoir, and she's a poet, but she has some really interesting and smart things to say about being Asian American. And so that's something I've enjoyed lately.
Thank you, Keith. And I know our H3 group will package your recommendations as a follow-up. This hour has flown by so quickly. Thank you for this very insightful discussion. I can see that there are questions that have come through the chat. I don't know that we have time, but Ray and Sandeep, I'll ask you to queue us up if there are questions that we can take in the next couple of minutes.
Hi, Sherry. We'll just take one question. It came through a few minutes ago. Can the panel please underline the animosity that has been building between Asian communities and Black communities specifically? And how has the mass media tried to paint the narrative to continue this us versus them false narrative? How did it start? When did it start? Why did it start?
That's a huge question. Keith, I think you started and provided some background to that. Did you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it has had a history, certainly from the 60s, deliberate. All right, what I want to say is that this is kind of a deliberate manipulation that is designed to separate people. It's designed to pit people against each other. Right. And so it's not something that was generated from our communities. It's not something that, it gets a life of its own, but it certainly has been there from, it's part of that. So I think that history that's the most important thing that I would say, that it is something that, racism, it works by dehumanizing people. May I appreciate your bringing us back to the human being, right? And so these are ways in which we have just been pitted against people, and we get those messages. Everybody gets those messages, anti-Black messages, and it's in our minds. And so when there are some advantages maybe to being separated in that way, we might be tempted by that. That's why we got to take a stand always and be conscious of that.
Thank you. I wish we had so much more time together, but certainly a conversation that will continue. Keith, Keawe, May, thank you so much for being with us. Mahalo. Raj, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. This has been just an amazing conversation. I can see the messages coming through that are so appreciative of this just open and honest conversation. I hope we can continue this. Thank you, everyone, for joining again. We'll make this conversation and recording available within the next 24 hours. And May, Keith, and Keawe, I hope we can have you again. Sherry, thanks for doing an amazing job moderating. And thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Mahalo nui. Aloha, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.